Hi, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is Vance Davis on my channel, Bible, and No Traditions. I want to share a message with you that I heard many years ago from a dear teacher of mine and friend and brother in Christ. His name was Richard Rogers. He did a lesson and he called it The Heart of God. And I want to do that lesson for you and share it with you how touching a lesson it is from the book of Hosea. This could be called, as Richard called it, the tragedy of the parsonage. Because the book of Hosea is autobiographical. It's the story of a prophet's broken home and a prophet's broken heart. It's the 8th century BC, a time of gross immorality. As Amos said, it was a time when a man and his father used the same woman to satisfy their lust. Amos chapter 2, verse 7. And the women would cry out of the house to their husbands, "Bring, let us drink. Bring, let us drink." Amos chapter 4, verse 1. It's a time when everybody goes to the Baal worship again in the 8th century BC. And the only way that worship could be brought to completion is by the physical act of intercourse with a temple prostitute, male or female. And so the religious people of Hosea's day were gross fornicators. Maybe it was for that reason that Hosea had chosen not to marry in his day. But he's already grown. He's already a prophet of God. And God comes to him and says to him, "Take thee a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom." Now, I'm grateful for the children of whoredom because that means that Gomer wasn't an immoral woman at the time she married Hosea, because the children were not whores at the time they were born. The children would become guilty of whoredom. God knew that later on. So God says, you marry a woman knowing that she shall become guilty of whoredom, and you're going to have children knowing that they will become guilty of whoredom. He met Gomer. I'm sure he loved her, he wouldn't have married her, and I'm sure she loved him. I imagine she was even swept off her feet by the love of such a man as Hosea. Because here's one man, maybe the only man that there was in the whole country, maybe in all of Israel, that could bring the treasure of an unsquandered purity to the marriage altar. He had the zeal of a prophet, the ardor of a patriot, and the heart of a prophet, and the zeal of a poet. And I'm sure for a while their house was filled with love, his for her and hers for him. But you see, she did not share his number one concern. Hosea's number one concern was the fact that he was a prophet of God. And as a prophet, he had to preach sometimes damnation and judgment to the nation he loved, Israel. And he would not, because he could not go with her or take her to the parties and the revelries and the Baal worship of Israel. And I'm sure that after a while, even though it's not written in the book of Hosea, but I'm sure that after a while, she would fling some of this in his face, such things as, "Oh, you love your work more than you love me," or "Preach, preach, preach." I mean, that's all you ever think about. All you want to do is talk doom, damnation, and destruction, she would say. "I'm losing my friends," she'd say. "The girls and the men that used to be my friends now look down at me because of your preaching. And the fact that we don't go to the wayside altar with them anymore. We don't get to go to the parties and the revelries." And I could just imagine Hosea saying to her, "Darling, honey, don't you see that these are the things that are leading our beloved nation into eternal damnation and destruction?" Kind of sounds like America, doesn't it? We must avert this, and God has given me the opportunity to preach this to our country. She'd say, "I don't care what God has done or said. He's not the only God anyway. We can go down and bow before the Baal God and enjoy ourselves. We don't have to follow that old tacky Jehovah." But so Hosea had one purpose, And his purpose was to warn Israel, preachers, as we are to warn America or wherever we are. But his job was to warn Israel of their coming doom. And so now he lives in a house that you could hardly any longer call a home. For years, maybe he did that. And then something happened that gave the prophet renewed hope. The sweet angel of suffering visited their home, and his wife became pregnant. And in the course of time, she bore a son. And he holds that son in his arms, in his hands, and he calls his name Jezreel. Jezreel's a valley, you see, that runs from the mountain called Carmel to the mountains of Tabor in Gilboa. The valley of Jezreel, the valley of Megiddo, Armageddon, a place where God's army, greatly outnumbered, has always won its victories. So maybe in his mind he was naming the boy Victory. But you see, the word literally means, Jezreel, literally means scattered. So God had him name his son Jezreel, not for the victory intended, but for the fact that he was going to be scattered from his wife as Israel would be from God. Then the prophet thought that this boy would put one hand on me and one hand on my wife and bring us closer together again, and we'll love one another as in days gone by, and things would be so much better. Things will be like they were. Love will be restored. But Hosea was greatly mistaken. For that boy, rather than bring them together, drove them further apart. Tempestuous years, you see, swept by with him still preaching, her still fornicating, and a daughter's born. And God says, call her name Lo Ruhamah, which means unloved or unpitied. For that's the way he now feels in his own home, unloved. Years go by again, and a son is born, and God says, call this one's name Lo Ami, which means not mine. So now that perplexing doubt becomes in reality a damning certainty, that he knows for sure now that a child born in his own house isn't even his own, but the results of one of her fornicating acts with one of her many lovers. And still he doesn't divorce her. That must have been a consternation to his friends and scornful amazement to his enemies. And as a matter of fact, they said, the man who has the Spirit is a fool, the prophet's mad. Here's a prophet preaching about immorality, and he's living with a whore. They laughed at him, but he loved her, and he went on preaching. And then one day he came home, and Richard likes to say, you'll have to excuse me here, he had an imagination, and I do too. I know it's got to be there. He came home and he entered the house, and there's no sound of a wife about her duties as a wife. There's no smell of dinner being cooked. And he listens carefully, and he can hear the whimper coming from one of the rooms where his 3 children are. And he goes and finds them there all alone. And on the table, I believe there's a note. The book doesn't say there's a note, but old Richard Rogers was right when he said this, and I agree with it. I don't think any woman has ever left without leaving a note. On the table was a note, and the note would have read something like this. Hosea, I no longer love you. Haven't loved you for years. Don't love the children. Don't care anything for them. Now I've gone after my lovers. Leave me alone. Don't look for me. I'm not coming back, so don't try to find me. Sincerely, but no longer yours, Gomer. He put his children to sleep. He went over to the window and he looked out that night, and the next day, and the next night, and the next day. Nights without any stars and days without any sunshine, till finally it dawns on him. Dawns upon his heart that she was gone and was never coming back. Then looking back through the telescope of his tears, Hosea saw deeper into the heart of God than anybody had ever seen before or ever would see again until Jesus died on the Calvary cross. And Hosea saw 3 things. First of all, he saw the real magnitude and the character of sin. 16 times in the book of Hosea, Hosea uses one word to describe sin. He calls it whoredom. I don't know if any of you ever really seen a whore. Having been in the military for years and traveling overseas in some deprived areas of Vietnam and other nations, you would see them in Hong Kong, Taipei, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And for $2, you could have a woman for the night. You know, when I read the book of Hosea and I realized that when we had been walking in sin with both eyes wide open, that's exactly what you and I were. Whores. I know that's offensive. It needs to be offensive because you see sin. Sin needs to be offensive to us. I just cannot imagine how tragic it would be for me to find out that my wife was unfaithful to me. But it'll never happen. She's not that kind of woman. See, God didn't tell me to marry that kind of woman, and I'm so eternally grateful to Him for that. But you know what? God married that kind of a woman, or that kind of a person when He married me. God married that kind of a person when He married you. And even today, if we decide we're just going to go out and commit this one little sin, all right, just one, that means that's one act of whoredom. And if we decide we're going to do one more little act of sin, it won't hurt anything. I'll just commit this other little sin. That's 2 acts of whoredom. How many acts of whoredom does it take to make you a whore? You see, Hosea is learning, and I hope we are too, that sin is not a trifle. It's a tragedy. He's learning that sin is something you don't toy around with. Because you see, Hosea no longer has his woman. He no longer has his wife, and he has found out the real, true nature of sin. Secondly, he found out that God was a suffering God. He found out that God suffered. You say, well, that's easy. I already read and I knew that God suffered. Yes, but you and I have the revelation of Calvary. You check with the pagans. There's not a single pagan god out here that suffers. Richard Rogers told us the story in class one time of how he had had a discussion with one of the leaders of the Hindu religion in India. And he asked the Hindu leader how many gods they had. And he said, oh, I don't really know. Richard said, is there 200,000, 250, 500,000? Kept going up and going up. And he finally said, 1 million. And the leader said, well, I'm not sure if there's that many. So Richard said, well, so for the sake of discussion between 500,000 and 1 million. He said, and the next question he asked that man was, well, how many of your gods suffer? And the man laughed at him and said, why, none of our gods suffer. We don't have any weak gods like your Jesus. Richard said, I just had to ask you, how many of your gods have an empty tomb? But you see, the point was made that he wanted to make. No pagan gods suffer. It was a miracle nearly that Hosea discovered that God suffered, but how did he learn that God suffers? You watch Hosea preach. Here he is on the streets of Samaria, about to preach about destruction. And there goes his wife down the street with another man, turning into that man's hut. The next day he's preaching on another street corner. And here she is coming down the street with another man of lesser degree. And finally, he's preaching, and here she comes with the town drunk. Next day he sees her, and she's just standing on the corner looking for any man that would have her. And here's Hosea's hell. He still loves her. If he could just quit loving her, if he could quit loving her, stop caring about her, if he could just quit loving her, maybe he would stop hurting, but he can't. He can't stop loving her, and he can't stop caring for her. So he gets to thinking, look, if I'm suffering like this because of the unfaithfulness of my wife, imagine how God suffers because of the unfaithfulness of his wife Israel. If a finite creature like me suffers like this, how infinitely greater must be the suffering of the infinite God. As he looks at the whoredoms of his wife, he realizes something. Perhaps we can look at this as well. Do you know it's a biological fact that creatures are graded on their existence of the life scale by their ability sometimes to feel pain? If it's high on the life scale, it feels greater pain. If it's low, it feels very little pain. Crabs. One crab could be eating another crab while a crab's eating him, and neither one of them know they're being eaten. They don't feel pain. Little birds can feel some pain. You see their babies being threatened, and they squawk and they scream and they carry on for somebody to help save their babies. And people suffer greatly. Funerals where I've been, hospital beds that I've visited, the places where many times mothers lie. Being at the side of a boy in the hospital, dying while in total rebellion to his mother and the Lord. What words can you find to bring comfort to her? Other than just saying, God loves you. God loves you. She looked at him and say, oh, he was a good boy. Yeah, maybe at 4 or 5. But not when he died. He wasn't a good boy. You see, that woman suffered. And she was suffering. And as high as that woman is above a crab, so God is higher than the woman or us. I don't think you and I really realize how we must make our God feel when we sin. Remember, sin doesn't mean just to go out and commit immorality. Sin actually means to fail to live up to one's capabilities. It means to miss the mark which God has put out there for you. Not you put it out there, God put it there for you to hit. Which means you can hit it if God put it there for you. So if you and I don't measure up to the capabilities that God has given us, then we're living in sin. We're guilty of whoredom and guilty of making God suffer. Third point. Hosea found out that God was eager to forgive. How did he learn that? Same way, preaching. Here comes Gomer, and Hosea says, excuse me, sir, a minute. I can't preach anymore. And he goes after his wife, and he says, honey, come on home. She tells him, didn't you read my note? I don't love you. Don't love the children. Leave me alone. I love this man, and others like him are having fun in life. I'm going to his house. We're having a good time. She's walking away, and I can imagine him shouting after her with cupped hands. Remember, any time you want to come home, darling, the door's open for you. The children miss you. I love you. She wasn't coming home. What made him willing to do that? He loved her, right? Maybe he got to thinking what Abe Lincoln said he endured one time in trying to teach a young girl at camp, when he talked to her about ability to do certain things. Young lady there had been married to a preacher, and she got to thinking that maybe she had a lot of psychological problems, but she felt that maybe her life and the things she did was hindering her husband from serving God, so she slashed both of her wrists. Did a poor job of it. Fortunately, she didn't die. And Brother Abe came and sat down with her on a cot beside her bed, and he said to her, do you think God loves you? And she said, no way. I know God doesn't love me. And Abe said to her, do you think I love you? She said, oh yeah, Brother Abe, I know you love me. And with the wisdom that only a man like old Brother Abe could do, and it made him be selected even as an elder there, he said, darling, who do you think it is that gave me the cause and the ability to love you? Well, she didn't get rid of all of her psychological problems that night, but she got rid of that one. She knew God loved her, and she knew it because Abe loved her, and she understood it because God enabled Abe to love her. Hosea knew that God loved Israel because he loved Gomer. Hosea knew that God was willing to forgive even rebellious, ungodly, adulterous, fornicating, sinful Israel. Why? Because he was anxious to and eager to forgive ungodly, immoral, fornicating, and adulterous Gomer. He knew that Israel could not sink so low that God would not be willing to forgive. because his wife Gomer couldn't sink that low. Story's not over. Word comes to Hosea, Gomer's selling herself today on the slave market. Oh, how she hates Hosea. All she had to do was go home, doors open. Just be his wife again, play the hypocrite, eat and sleep well, stay warm, be loved, clothed, housed. But she hates Hosea so much that she won't go home when no one else will even have her. Now she's going to sell herself on the open slave market. I don't know what Hosea was doing, but I believe when he heard that she was selling herself, he dropped whatever he was doing, ran by his home and got all his meager belongings and ownings that he could gather up and took to the slave auction. I could hear that auctioneer. What am I bid for this woman? Oh, I know she isn't pretty. She's old, even beyond her days, rather worn out. She could still clean your house, sweep your floors, maybe cook a meal or two and tend your children while you go out and enjoy the good life. What am I bid? I don't know if anybody even bid for her. But Hosea had stopped by the house and picked up all he had, 15 and a half omers of barley and 15 shekels of silver. I'm told that's the price for a wounded slave. I know that that's all that man had. And the auctioneer said, sold. And he took his wife back home and he said, just sit over here in this corner. You'll abide with me many days and be no man's wife, and neither will I be a husband toward you till you can return to me in faithfulness and purity. What happened? Well, we don't know the rest of the story. We're left to draw some conclusions from the prophet. I'd like to believe that she repented and turned back to Hosea and her family. But I really can't do that. Really can't, because I don't have the right to. It would break rather the parallel in the story of Israel, because Israel never did come back to God. Even after God gave for them more than the price of a wounded slave, he gave his son for them, put them over in a corner called Assyria. They never came back. Wasn't because God didn't want them or didn't love them. Anytime they wanted to, God was ready to forgive. All they had to do was come back. I don't want to end on that note. Tell you about a man in Chicago. It was before the Great Depression. Rich beyond measure. He heard the Depression was coming and liquidated everything he had and turned it into gold. Used the gold during the Depression, worked day and night, made himself worth $235 million by the end of the Depression. But he had broken himself physically and mentally. Just totally exhausted himself. Went to the doctor. Doctor tells him, you need to go somewhere where you can have some real restful quietness. He said, doctor, I don't even know where that is. The doctor said, well, let me tell you about this farm I have in Kentucky. And back in those Depression days where Kentucky was really beautiful in its 1931 time of old plantations and scenery, the doctor sitting there and said, stay there as long as you need to. Come back when you're feeling better and see me. Well, he did that, and he stayed at that beautiful plantation. It was so glorious. Soon he got to feeling better and began to take walks. And as he took a walk one day, he met a beautiful young Kentucky girl, fell head over heels in love with her, married her, took her back to Chicago, and oh, they had joy in that palace fair that he had. And there was joy like never before. But then one day she became deathly ill. Her fever was tremendous, lost her mind. Took her to doctor after doctor after doctor. All they could say was, only thing you can do is put her in an institution. He said, I'm not going to do it. He'd take her back home, and her screams were so loud in the night that the people who lived near to them began to make complaints, took out petitions against him. So he went into the area of town and bought 4 blocks of the downtown area and built walls around it in Chicago. Sealed it all in, but still the screams were too loud. he went back to the doctor one last time, the doctor who had taken care of him. And the doctor said, why don't you take her back to where you found her? Maybe that will jog her memory. So he took her back to Kentucky, stayed there for a while. I don't mean like 2 or 3 days, months, till he thought she was going to pass away. Thought I better take her back to our home in Chicago. Carried her out and put her in the car. Her head just slumped over on his shoulder. He thought she had passed away. But he found as he laid her in the bed in Chicago, she was alive. And he placed her in the bed gently. And the next morning he drew the curtains back and she woke up and stretched and yawned and looked over at him. And she said, darling, where have you been? And with a heart that only he, Hosea, and God could really understand, he said, right here, darling, just waiting on you to come home. Just waiting for you to come home. That's the heart of God, and I think it's found in the book of Hosea. But what about today? What about you? Do you need to come home to God? Do you need to obey the gospel of Christ and come to God? Don't wait till you can't reply and life is too short. God bless you. Have a good day. Bye.